Hey guys, welcome to this tutorial on how to create de-aging inside of Nuke using the CopyCat node. I've been talking about this for the last couple of years, and a lot of people have asked for this on my YouTube channel, so I'm now putting this up on Patreon for you guys to check out and see my exact workflow on how I approach doing beauty and de-aging shots inside of Nuke compositing. This right here is the de-aged shot of this actor. This is just stock footage. You can use any footage that you want, grab your own stock footage, or shoot anybody in your life that you want to do beauty work or de-aging on, and the processes are pretty much the same, so the workflow should be pretty consistent. This is what we received when we were first working on the shot, and I'm going to show you how we turned this guy into this guy. So this is just the same piece of footage playing back, but de-aged. Now, of course, we're going to be doing this all inside of Nuke compositing, so this is how we get right on into it. We're going to break this down into 3 steps for our compositing technique, okay? First, we're going to start by creating a ground truth keyframe. I'm going to show you exactly what that is and also talk to you a little bit about how I choose which frames I want. But what is a ground truth keyframe? And that has to do with training, which is the second step of what we're going to be doing. There is the input keyframes as well as the ground truth keyframes. We're basically training a machine learning AI model on what the input of your footage should look like, and then also what the output of your footage should look like as well. And that's what your ground truth keyframe is basically what your desire of what your output of your keyframe will be. And then your third and final step is going to be just doing a pretty basic composite, and I'll show you basically the best way to try to retain as much detail of your footage as possible, have the least amount of glitches inside of your footage as well. So without further ado, let's go ahead and start talking about the ground truth keyframe. This is going to start by creating a visual effects plate. I have found, at least with this CopyCat AI workflow, you kind of want everything to be consistent as far as like color spaces are concerned, because when you're doing training, it's going to be comparing the data, the from and the to, and that's everything from the RGB channel as well as your alpha channel. So you kind of want consistency throughout on everything. So in our ground truth keyframe, we're going to be working inside of like an ACES pipeline. I fed in our input here, and we just played it back. Really is the first step, is just playing back your footage and finding how your actor is moving. Using this on a film, I've worked on Ted Lasso with this. I've used this in a feature film, was actually where we first designed kind of like this pipeline of using CopyCat. And we found that through different sequences, there was some consistencies throughout that we were able to use the same AI models for. So you kind of want similar lighting setups, similar camera angles, things like that. But with inside of that, you want to create keyframes between those sequences that are perhaps your actor looking in different directions. So you kind of want to pay attention. Is the camera moving around them? What is going on that could be different throughout the shot that you need to tell the computer how to adjust for? They're less of keyframes of like the beginning and end as much as they are more of keyframes of, well, at the beginning of the shot, I'm facing this direction, and then I'm going to look this way, and then maybe I come back. Well, if I got the first frame and the last frame of that shot, it would both be facing towards the camera. So maybe your keyframe would be then in the middle of your shot where your face is in a different direction. Think about like the nose and like different parts of the chin. You're going to want the AI model to be able to see things from different perspectives. In this particular shot, it's pretty straightforward. We could probably grab the first and last keyframe, which is actually what I did here. And because the camera is moving around him, and there's 2 things to note in here. Not only is the camera in different spots, but his facial expression changes throughout the shot. And that gives us the ability of going, okay, well, we know what we're going to want him to look like when we're de-aging him in one facial expression. We're also going to want to know how to de-age him in a different facial expression. And that all kind of plays into this as well. So with that being said, I can see that like here in the first keyframe area, the first frame of the shot, his lips are kind of down. He's not smiling as much. And then here he is smiling. If he blinks, maybe I'm going to want to de-age a frame where he's blinking. If he's talking and his mouth is open, we're going to want to de-age a frame of him talking. All that to say, each shot is going to vary with the amount of keyframes you're going to need. I've done shots where I've only needed 1 keyframe, and I've done shots where I've done 2 keyframes. I've also done shots where I've done 8 or 12 keyframes. So sometimes there could be more work depending on that. And if you're building your AI model, it will slowly grow over time, where then you will be able to have like many keyframes, and maybe you won't even need to train new keyframes depending on the shot. This is in comparison, by the way, for de-aging against using 3D models. If you're using 3D models, then you're spending thousands of hours of reanimation, paint outs, and match moving, and all of that in order to get this. This method, even though it is still a little bit of work in order for you to do this, is going to be so incredibly more efficient for you to do on a per VFX shot basis. So I broke this down into 2 shots. I used a frame hold, and then also just setting the frame range to a single frame here. We were able to set up these 2 keyframes here, which is essentially just him smiling near the end of the shot and him not smiling at the beginning of the shot. Things to note here, his hair does go off on one of the keyframes, so if you want to try to compensate for that by adding a 3rd keyframe, that also can be very useful. I did not here, and I didn't have any problems. So sometimes it's a little bit of trial and error, and luckily it doesn't take too long to figure out if you need to add additional keyframes. It doesn't hurt you to have too little keyframes, because you can always retrain or continue your training later, but we'll get to that in a moment. Then I just append these together, and we're basically creating just like this little sequence here that is going to have your actor kind of in this 1 frame here, and then your 2nd frame there. But we need to do all of our paint out work, and this is going to be using a process called frequency separation, which is essentially just adding a blur node, blurring this so that way you can get your color values of your actor. You want to blur it just enough where you're removing the details of kind of these wrinkles in his face, but then also keeping the values of the color there as well. And then you're going to take that and divide that against the original image. And once you do that, it gives you this frequency separation. This is all the details of your wrinkles inside of your shot. And we're going to be painting these out just using this RotoPaint node right here. Now, I like to have my RotoPaint node with the opacity set to something like 0.1 or 0.01 or something really small. And if you do your paint here with this is another thing, I set my color value here to, let's see if I could just show you the hex values of this. Is that possible for me to do? It's like slightly off white, and I don't, yeah, it's just slightly off white. I think it's like set to 0.126 or something like that. And that value there will allow me to do my RotoPaint directly after this divide. And then we're going to multiply this back. And if you multiply this back and compare this to the original image, you'll see that everything is exactly the same. So we're canceling each other out, but we're doing our RotoPaint in between that. You're going to do kind of like some color work here. So if you want to try to get rid of some of these more egregious wrinkles that are coming through on this color, as well as this area here, you could do your RotoPaint on that section as well. I'll show you a little bit of how this works. Just paint a little bit. Try to maintain as much detail as possible, because the smoother your image is, the less realistic it's going to look. And I'll show you my ground truth keyframes here in a moment that I already created for this, because I'm not going to do all this work. But you would spend a lot of time here trying to create these keyframes to look as realistic as possible. You want to try to maintain as much detail. We can also paint some of that detail back in, just, always paying attention to exactly what you're removing here, and just kind of cleaning this up. I like to also use a little bit less opacity. That way I've got a little bit more finite control. I don't like to completely remove my wrinkles. It's more fading them. And that's where you're going to find a lot of the power of the de-aging here, is that you don't want to remove too much. If you de-age someone too much and they have too smooth of a skin, you can see that in other movies. I've seen like Sandra Bullock in movies where they've done like de-aging on her, and her skin is just so perfectly smooth in the movies that they've come out. I think Bullet Train was where I saw some de-aging done there. And it was just too much. They de-aged her a little too much, and it looks unrealistic. Unless that's her real skin, If she got real skin like that, then that's amazing. But sometimes if you go a little too much, it can really draw attention to itself. You don't want to draw attention to yourself. You want to be as realistic as possible. So you would follow the creases here. Next up, I'm just going to jump down the line here. We do some lighting and shadow adjustments. I like to do, again, through like a simple roto paint node adjustment here. We're just going to go ahead and use some painting. This right here is going to be your lighting first, which I like to just boost it. We can adjust these settings later, but I like to do both lighting and shadows separately. And just using a roto paint node, we can paint in our area. So as I said, for some of these sections here, there's a little bit of shadow inside of the skin, but if we paint in some of these areas, we can then remove that shadow that was being caused from the original wrinkle that's there. If you have really egregious wrinkles, like areas that are casting shadows on the skin itself, you want to come in and then you kind of want to just like remove those by just painting in some additional lighting on top of it. And then same with adding in shadows. Maybe you want to make the face look more angular in a specific area because maybe it's a little too flat. Sometimes older faces can become a little bit saggy or pudgy in certain areas. So you need to reshape the cheekbones as well as the jawline. Those are important things. You kind of want to singe areas a little bit better. And so take time to really find those sections and spend time to try to make sure these keyframes are as good as possible, because this is where the real magic is. The actual paintbrushes that you're doing here is going to be reflected inside of your AI shot later. AI won't magically make your actor look younger. It's this moment here. It's when you get these keyframes to look exactly how you want them to, the AI will then use that as its ground truth. So spend time here to first get the actor to look exactly like what you want. But then also between your different keyframes, you're going to need to actually have quite a bit of consistency. Try to have as much consistency as possible. So if you have multiple keyframes, now's the time to really spend time to really paint that out. I believe I did a shot this last summer where we were doing some de-aging work on a Netflix project. And that's where we spent quite a bit of time, like almost a whole day, just painting keyframes on a single shot. So this can take a little bit of time, and you just need to have that kind of patience coming into it to make sure that your keyframes look as good as possible. Then from there, we just output these as EXR files. And I output them as EXR files, so that way I don't have to worry about it processing everything during the training process. And that way you've got clean keyframes coming into something. And that takes us to our second step. After creating these ground truth keyframes, we will then be going over to our training section, where we have our EXR files of our ground truth as well as our input. So I actually outputted these input keyframes here as just EXR files, and then I also outputted the ground truth keyframes. These were the ground truth keyframes that I created. You could tell that I was keeping the detail of the skin as much as possible. I was trying to keep those sunspots in there because that allows it to feel more textural, allows it to feel more realistic in the end of the day, while maintaining all of that. Of course, you're going to want to darken the hair, or maybe depending on what your shot is, how much you want to de-age someone. This is the creative conversation you'll have with the filmmakers for your project that you're working on. In this particular case, I didn't have anybody. This is just for this tutorial purpose here, but we then just created these keyframes, and you can compare these to the inputs of exactly what I did here. I didn't remove the wrinkles completely. We are kind of maintaining. Oh, it looks like I have my subscribe thing popping up there. That's hilarious. But the wrinkles we didn't remove completely. I like to try to maintain a little bit of the original facial structure as much as possible. And then again, trying to maintain that consistency between our keyframes. I had 2 keyframes here, so I spent quite a bit of time just making sure these looked good, because these are for a tutorial that I'm working on for Foundry. And then again, we're going to just append these together. You'll see that it's just 2 frames. And then I'm just cropping. That's all we're doing now, is we're just going to crop the different parts of your facial structure. Again, try to, in this particular case, I like to use a crop, and I do crop pretty close to the face. I don't want too much of the background. Previously on a project that we worked on, sometimes you'll get to an area where the background will start to blend in with the skin tones. We had this on really egregious colors. For instance, yellow. There was these shots that we did on this film where there were these yellow painted wall behind the actor. and it started to make the skin of the actors really yellow. In that particular case, we'll just use a merge node or something like that and use a roto and just do a clean roto around the actor. So that way we're actually just doing it with a black background, and that helped with the AI. So sometimes you might need to isolate your character a little bit more than just using a crop node. Sometimes you'll have to actually roto out the background, and that might help. I thought maybe this green would cause that problem as well. However, on this specific training, it didn't create any issues. So again, these are just an animated crop node. Make sure to copy and paste this crop node so it's exactly the same between your input keyframes as well as your ground truth keyframes. It needs to literally be identical. It can't be 1 pixel off. So whatever you do on the one has to be identical on the other. And that's because the CopyCat node itself, the way it works is that it is comparing the input keyframe here to the ground truth keyframe. It's basically a from and to, if you're thinking about it from a coding perspective. It knows it's going from this pixel value to this pixel value here, right? So you have to basically think of it that way. The way CopyCat works is that it's using a pattern recognition of sorts. And you can use CopyCat for really anything. This video is specifically about de-aging, but if you want to change a blanket, or if you want to change a flag, or we used it for changing clothing on people, you can do the exact same procedures, but just changing a from and a to, and it's just pattern recognition. But with that being said, there are a few settings that we need to take note of inside of CopyCat, since it is pattern recognition. First of all is the crop size, the size of which your pattern is. In our particular case, I chose 128. This will take a little bit of trial and error. I found for like a mid-size face here that's about this large, you can go with a 128 or a 256. If the face was a little closer to the camera, I probably would have gone with a 256. That also depends on what exact amount of detail you are changing from and to. If your input keyframe has quite a bit of wrinkles on the face, like many different patterns that could be very recognizable to the computer, in that particular case, you do want to have a smaller crop size. If it is more generally speaking, let's say a 40-year-old man that you want to make look 30. So his face is smoother, so there's less details on his face of what the from and the to is supposed to be. In that particular case, you are going to want to use a larger crop size because that will allow the AI to see a larger image as a whole to work with. In this particular case, I tried 128. I just ran the epochs, worked great. And that's where I went. There is multi-resolution training, which is another interesting newish feature with CopyCat. I am pretty old school with this, so I usually just uncheck this because I know that the settings that I want to have are good for me. This actually makes your training faster. So it will do it at a smaller resolution for the first, I think X amount, I can't remember exactly what number it is, of training sets, and then it will increase its training set to the end. And then that way it is actually being very efficient. I haven't done a lot of tests with this. The projects that I've done, I've always unchecked it, and we've just eaten the training time because we work it into our budgets. Next up is the model size. I choose large. That's the detail of how much detail you want your, how close you want your model to be on the final output of it. I believe that's exact kind of how it works. It's the aspect of it where it's taking note of the detail and the amount of data that it's retaining with inside of its model. So I always set mine to large. Again, we've done some tests. I've done medium in the past and haven't had a lot of issues with it. Mostly kept it at large, and that's what's given me the best results. When we did our testing between our projects, I found large to work the best for us. Next up is batch size. You can manually input a batch size. However, I have always kept this at auto and never had problems with it. If you want to set your batch size, I think this is based off of how many CUDA cores you have within inside of your computer, then yes, manually go in. It's like whether to calculate the batch size automatically or yeah. I believe this is based off, let's see, the number of ground input frames to train at each step. Smaller numbers may dictate inefficiency, but larger numbers will cause. Okay, again, this is based off of, I believe, your CUDA cores or your CPU. So if you want to clock your machine at like a specific amount of training, maybe you're doing multiple trainings at the same time on a single computer, then maybe you do want to have a little bit more finite control with your batch size. But in my particular case, I just set it to auto because it just works for us this way. Initial weights. This is if, let's say, as I was talking about earlier, where you had maybe a training that you already created with this actor. You're de-aging 20 minutes of a film, which is something we did. And so we would use previous checkpoints of other files that we created. In this particular instance, I could load the inference training that I already have. You're just going to load a cat file. And let's say I loaded in the last one that I created, which was 67,022. Okay, I can load this cat file in, and then I can have a checkpoint. So that way it's not starting from scratch. You're actually starting from an area that already has kind of like this machine learned model created. And that way you don't have to train for as many iterations. Maybe you only have to train for 10,000 iterations or 20,000 iterations. And that brings me to my last, which I'm going to set that to none. That brings me to my last section up here. First, you're going to set your data directory to a specific folder. You probably just saw that folder I put. It's going to put a lot of files in here, okay? It's going to create all of your training cat files, but it's also going to output, by the way, preview files, checkpoint files, like everything. So you want to have a separate directory. Don't just put it on your desktop, otherwise you're going to regret that a lot later. So just create a separate folder for it. I usually just call it 01, 02 or whatever training number I want to be at. And then of course, if you're referencing any other previous trainings, then you will want it to be the same folder as that. Don't change folders if you're trying to reference your training later. And then your epochs, which is essentially a iteration number of times that your AI is going to go through and retrain that data. So it's going to look at each frame, and I think it bases it off of, it's going to do 1 and 2. So when I set this to 60,000, it's going to do 12,000 different checkpoint frames. I believe that's how it works. And again, if you're using auto here, let's just say that's set to 8. Well, then each frame is going to actually have 8 different breakup points that it's looking at. And from those 8 different breakup points, you're going to have, or actually, no, it's the crop size, not the batch size here. The crop size is going to break this up at 128 pixels by 128 pixels. And that 128 pixels may be, let's just say it's 4, 5, or 6 different spots on this image here. It's going to be 128 pixels. I actually didn't do the math on this. What is this value here? It's just getting smaller. I can't even see it. But it's going to break up your image at 128 by 128 pixels, and then it's going to use that to basically train your model. So if you have 60,000 epochs, then that can multiply up to some crazy number of squares that it's going to do. Don't freak out about that. You don't have to do the math on it. You don't even have to think about it. But the numbers to kind of think about here, 40,000 in my experience, and again, this may be different per shot. It may be not enough, on some shots. We've had to train some things. We just have to let it cook for a really long time. But 40,000 usually is the minimum number of epochs that I would work with. Generally speaking, we would probably be a little bit closer to 100,000 if it's a shot that we know is a real close-up like this shot is. In this sense, I did 60,000 and the shot is literally perfect. I think this might have been the best de-aging shot I've ever done in my life. And 60,000 epochs was perfect. I actually think 67,000 epochs was what I ended up hitting. I think I said 100,000 and then I waited till it hit 60,000, was looking down at my phone and I looked up and I was like, oh, it's already at 67,000. So I stopped it. So that is totally fine. You know, and again, you can always continue your training. And that brings us to these 3 buttons here. There is the start training button, which is going to be the only button you have when you first create a CopyCat node. Let's just drop in a CopyCat here. Let's say plug the ground truth in, plug your input in. And if we go look at that, you'll notice that it only has start training. And if I go create a new folder here, let's call this O2, I'll just hit open now. It's going to only allow me to hit start training. And again, we'll want to set this value to something like 60,000. Go through all of our settings here. So large, right? We could use our initial checkpoint, but let's just say we don't want to. Or if we do, I'll show you that this ungrays itself. So we go back over here to 01, and let's just say we started at 67,000. So we've got that checkpoint there. We're going to set our crop size to 128, and that all looks good. Again, we're matching our kind of previous render that we were creating, and then we would hit start training, and since we have this checkpoint in, it's basically starting at 67,000 epochs, and that's kind of like how that's working. But again, for this CopyCat node here, 60,000 works perfect for us. That's the start training button. That's the first thing you'll ever have to do. If you ever pause your training for whatever reason, maybe you had to turn your computer off or whatever, you can hit resume training. Though, I will give you a bit of a thing to consider. If you only want to do like a couple thousand more epochs, maybe don't do the resume training, or keep this in mind. It jumps on the graph for its consistency really high. I think this might be a bug inside of Nuke. Not quite sure. But it does go back down again after its training has kind of like thought itself through. So just keep that in mind. Not a huge issue. It's not going to break anything, but that is just something to keep in mind. And then next up is your create inference node, which since we're already set up inside of this folder and it has trained already for 67,000, if I create inference, it's going to create this little node here, which is just referencing your cat file. You don't need to click that create inference button in order for you to get that CopyCat file. I'll show you how you can add that as well. Actually, I'll just do it right now. You just do inference air, and then it'll ask for your model size. You just go find that model, that latest cat file model that you have here. I actually don't know why it's giving an error right now. Let's see. I think it was just giving an error because I haven't clicked on it yet, or it wasn't viewing it. But you'll notice that once you do that, it actually de-ages our thing, which brings us to our whole second section, right? Which is compositing this thing. How do you take this and then use it inside of compositing? Because if I just went and viewed our image here, which I actually might have problems doing, yeah, I'll do that over on our next section. We're going to now take that inference node and go over to the compositing section of our tutorial, which is, again, we're bringing in our VFX plate. We're going to denoise that VFX plate. I don't like to use denoise. I personally like to use Neat Video, but I don't have it on this computer here. It's only at my work computer. So again, my recommendation is definitely Neat Video. Super cheap, works great inside of Nuke, and stellar application. So with that being said, though, we're going to denoise our video, and then we're going to break this up into a couple sections. Firstly, I created a roto of just the face using Magic Mask inside of DaVinci Resolve. You can use Mocha. You could do whatever. You could use After Effects' roto thing. But you'll notice right here is where our inference node is. This is our main plate, and then we'll have our inference. Now, one thing once I load this, you'll notice immediately, let's let it load for a second. It takes a second. It's using a lot of heavy GPU computing, so it actually might break. Yeah, you could tell my video is breaking a little bit. We'll wait until this loads. So once we load this inference node here, you'll notice that it's actually probably, let's see if there's an easy way for me to do this. You'll notice that it's actually creating glitches in other part of the image here. It's burning like the shirt and kind of like creating like these weird artifacts on like the plants back here and things like that. That's just something to keep in mind when using this inference node, is that whatever you're training, it's going to know how to do that? It's because it's doing pattern recognition. It's not really being super smart about it. It's just going, oh, I noticed that these pixel values here in this specific pattern were being changed to this. And it will try to do that on everything inside of your image, including his hands. You'll notice that it's trying to de-age his hand by removing some of the shadows here. And that is cool, right? But it's not exactly what we want. If we want to de-age someone's hands, we're probably going to do it in a very specific artistic way in which we're going to create keyframes for, in which case we'll also want to train our AI based off of that, using like our crop node and everything how we already were doing it anyways. So we need to be able to isolate that, and that's where using kind of like a magic mask or some kind of roto to just basically isolate the areas in which you want your footage to be. And so then using this, now we can actually just merge this back over top of our original image now, and we have our de-aged version of our face. And then moving down using our roto, we're going to put that inside of our alpha channel and bring that over. I like to use some detail restoration of some of the original wrinkles as well as the hair using a lapation set to about 9.8 with a triangle of 15. And then using that as well as merging with a geometric of the original plate. And this is going to bring in some of the original details of our wrinkles as well as some details around the eyes, and just kind of restoring a lot of the details with inside of the hair and making it feel less blurry. Because one of the things you'll notice is that de-aging can sometimes feel a little blurry, it could feel a little off, and that kind of just goes back to that Sandra Bullock de-aging stuff that I've seen before, or even the stuff some of the best de-aging I've seen was inside of Indiana Jones, this latest film that came out. And even still, there were some shots that were just like a little too smooth. And I think that's where spending quite a bit of time making sure that you are still keeping your sunspots and like different parts of your skin that make you, keeping those within inside of your image is the most important part of doing proper de-aging. And then this just gets set out to crop, and of course we're going to bring back our grain, and I like to use DOS grain inside of Nuke using our degrain plate, which we have here, as well as our original plate from up top, to bring back in this wonderful grain and noise with inside of our image that's going to restore everything back to where it was. And this gives you your final outputs of your image, which again, I already have these rendered out, but you'll notice that the details within inside of this are all retained. And since we're using everything inside of a proper ACES pipeline, we actually are maintaining the color values. The colorists are going to love you. You're not actually breaking everything down to SDR. This is all HDR compatible with keeping all the details of the grain as well as everything inside of your shots. But again, this is just my de-aging technique on the method in which I go about doing de-aging inside of Nuke. If you guys have any questions, go ahead and leave those in the comments below. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys in the next video where I don't even know what we're going to do. If you guys have any requests, go ahead and place those below. But I'll talk to you guys later. Thank you so much for watching this video.